Hi everybody, this is Brandon Finnegan, Director of Elections here at Decision Desk HQ. I want to welcome you back to our preview series of each of the upcoming major primaries. So August 2nd features a set of states, Arizona, Kansas, Missouri, Michigan, and Washington, holding their congressional, gubernatorial, senatorial primaries, along with a host of other races. Before we dive in, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and if you enjoy these videos, be sure to click that little bell so you're notified as soon as we've produced more of them so you can jump right on in and watch them. Let's go ahead and get over to the elections, alright? So first up, let's talk about Kansas. Polls close in most of the state at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Technically, there are some counties in Mountain Time that are allowed to close their polls as late as 8 p.m. local time, which would then translate to, or 7 p.m. local time, which would translate for us into 9 p.m. Eastern Time, those of us on the East Coast, but I digress. Most of the state, overwhelming part of the state, where we can start watching race results coming out of, polls close at 8 p.m. Now, the biggest race of the night in Kansas isn't a congressional primary or gubernatorial primary. Instead, it's the ballot question. Voters are going to be asked to decide if the state constitution contains a right to abortion. This is the first direct test of public opinion on the matter of abortion since the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. A yes vote would mean that the state legislature has the ability to pass laws restricting or even outright prohibiting abortion in the state of Kansas. Now, where should you look to watch what's going to happen here? Well, you have to not just look visually, but think with time. Now, what do I mean by that? Kansas is much like other states. You have early voting that's counted first typically, then you have election day votes, and then late provisional ballots and late coming in mail-in ballots. The more urban counties tend to report faster in Kansas than the rural counties do. They also tend to vote more Democratic or lean more liberally. As a result, we would expect them to have a lot more no votes, at least initially in the state of Kansas, because those areas will typically report first. These are counties that basically constitute the Kansas City suburbs, Overland Park and those areas around that in northeastern Kansas, and also the city of Wichita. So you're going to want to watch these areas and see how they're turning in, what the no vote is out of these counties. We expect these counties to vote no. And then the surrounding counties immediately around them, the suburban counties not quite in the urban cores, do they vote yes or no? And then, of course, the rural counties, which we expect to vote overwhelmingly yes. They will typically report last towards the end of the evening. So you may see something where the no votes are leading pretty healthily, but then as more and more of the state comes in, it might become more of a close race or maybe even reverse to yes. We don't really know until we actually start to see all these different areas report from the state. You're going to want to start tuning in pretty much right after about 8 p.m. to see the first returns come in. Moving on from Kansas, we'll go and talk with another state in the middle part of the country, actually the Midwest, up in the Great Lakes, the great state of Michigan. Now, most polls in Michigan close at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. There are 4 counties in the Upper Peninsula that are in the Central Time Zone, so they don't close until 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, that means we can't call any statewide race until 9 p.m., but all the congressional primaries, in theory, besides the 1st District, which contains those counties, could theoretically be called within that first hour between 8 and 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So kind of watch what our results are saying, watch what our calls are going out for a lot of those contests. The biggest race in the night is probably the Republican race for governor. It's been one of the crazier campaigns we've seen in a while. First up, we had 5 candidates that got removed from the ballot when it turned out the people they hired to collect nomination signatures either kind of flubbed or just didn't follow through on their paperwork or outright committed fraud, depending on who was doing what. One of the candidates that got unfortunately swept up into all of this was former Detroit Police Chief James Craig. He was viewed as one of the strongest contenders for the gubernatorial contest, was a strong challenger, considered a strong challenger to current incumbent Democrat Gretchen Whitmer. But he's not on the ballot anymore. Instead, you have 3 big names and a trickle of others. You got real estate developer Ryan Kelly, who was recently arrested in connection with activities involving January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. He still remains in the race and is kind of among the leading contenders. Then you got Tudor Dixon, figure in conservative media circles. He has the backing of the DeVos family and some of the more traditional GOP groups in the state. And lastly, you got Kevin Rink, who is a self-funding businessman who spent millions of his own dollars on his first run for office. Now, where should you look for a winner in the state of Michigan? Republicans are everywhere. They're everywhere in pretty much every state, whether you realize it or not. There are more of them, it seems, in the rural parts of the state, but believe it or not, there are just as many Republican voters in Wayne County as there are in a plethora of more rural counties in the state scattered across. We just don't typically notice that because this county votes so overwhelmingly Democratic in general elections. But there's still a good number of voters there. There's also a considerable contingent of Republican votes in the Detroit suburbs. The counties primarily Oakland and Macomb. You're going to want to watch that, see what's going to come out of that. And then further west is traditional Republican heartland from the state of Michigan. You got the counties surrounding, Kent County. You want to watch Kent. Kent has slipped a little bit more Democratic in recent years, but it's still going to have a large number of Republican votes, along with all the surrounding counties. And, you need to watch all the rural areas because they do cast votes, too. They came in strongly in close Republican years, and in previous Republican wave years, they were pretty helpful for the Republicans who were trying to get and achieve statewide office. But you can probably cheat by just watching Metro Detroit, Western Michigan, and kind of see who ends up pulling it from both areas, who ends up becoming the leader in both areas. Because odds are, if they're winning there, they're going to win the whole state overall. 2 House races to watch while we're still on the topic of Michigan, okay? A Republican race and a Democratic race. Democratic House primary, District 11, is member on member thanks to redistricting. It's a Biden plus 20 district now, concentrated entirely in Oakland County. Andy Levin, who's been endorsed by both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and then Haley Stevens, also an incumbent congresswoman from the state of Michigan. So this is going to be an interesting race. I would tell you where to look, but it's all in the same county, Oakland. So we're just going to have to wait for those early returns, election day returns, and late-breaking returns to figure out who's going to be the winner. And then there's the Republican primary I want to point out, which is in the U.S. House District number 3, the Republican primary there. That district, thanks to redistricting, is now roughly a Biden plus 9 district with a current vulnerable incumbent Republican, Peter Mayer. Now, this incumbent Republican actually voted to impeach Donald Trump and still has the backing of Republican establishment. It's more of a moderate, which might help in this now de-leaning district that exists, that didn't exist before. He is opposed by John Gibbs. Now, John Gibbs has the backing of former President Donald Trump. Trump even held a rally for him to attack Mayer. And Gibbs has also been the benefactor of some, indirect, if you will, spending by some Democratic groups that are trying to get him to challenge and defeat Mayer, in the logic that he'll be more vulnerable of a candidate in November. It really depends on your definition of where you think the country's going in terms of if we're going to actually have a wave election or not, how you view that district and its politics when it comes to midterm elections, but that's kind of the background and kind of factors going into this. So you're going to want to see this race. You're going to want to watch the District 11 race, of course, the gubernatorial Republican race, and of course, if you're living in Michigan, please tune in and watch all those down ballot races as well. Not just all the congressional races, but your state assembly races, your state Senate races. We're going to have it all. Let's move on to the state of Missouri, all right? Now, in Missouri, polls close at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and the biggest race of the night, the marquee race perhaps of the whole evening, is the GOP Senate race. Now, you've got 4 big contenders here. 2 Congress folk. You got Congresswoman Vicky Hartzler, who represents the central part of the state, and Congressman Billy Long, who represents the southwestern portion of the state. He's been in office slightly longer. Joining them, you have the sitting Attorney General Eric Schmidt for the state, and then you've got former Governor Eric Greitens. Now let's kind of start a little bit with Greitens. Greitens was, as I said, a former governor. He was forced to resign in a cloud of ethical and legal problems, and was even facing impeachment from his own Republican legislature. He was thought to be the leading candidate kind of going into this race a little bit, but recent polling has showed him kind of sliding behind the others. He's still kind of keeping it in there, though. With a 4-way race, effectively, it's anybody's ball game. Moving on to Schmidt, the sitting AG. He's received the backing of Ted Cruz and tech billionaire Peter Thiel, who's also backed several other key Republican senatorial candidates across the country. And then the 2 Congress folk, Vicky Hartzler and Billy Long. What I would say about these 2 is, if you see a real fight between Schmidt and Greitens, there's a possibility, a small possibility, you see an edge out from Hartzler or Long, depending on if they can get some real regional strength. Now, rural Missouri casts a large number of Republican votes, So we'll have to see if you see any pattern in the state. If you see Central Missouri voting for Hartzler, if you see Billy Long really racking it up in Southwest, maybe that's enough to help him offset if he's not doing so well in the cities. The big areas of Republican votes, besides, of course, scattered across the four winds of the rural parts of the state, are going to be in the suburban areas around Kansas City to the west and St. Louis to the east. Particularly, you're going to be wanting to look at, St. Charles County and St. Louis County, Cass County, Jackson County. You want to see how these counties are really pumping out their votes. They cast a substantial portion of the Republican vote, and they still cast a substantial portion of Republican votes even in the general election. So you're going to want to watch there, but don't miss out on all the other, the 100 so other counties that exist outside of St. Louis and Kansas City. Former President Donald Trump has not endorsed anyone at the time of this recording, so we'll see if that changes between now and when all of you at home get to watch this video, once it's been all edited and mapped out, fancified before the primary. I would like to move on to the state of Arizona in the Southwest, kind of moving away from the Midwest for a bit. Polls close in most of the state at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. They're open an hour later on, in reservation lands because they do actually observe daylight savings time. So the state does not report any results at all until 11 p.m. Eastern. We'll get a lot of votes shortly after because absentee and early voting is extremely popular in Arizona. It's tabulated rapidly, and we're going to get our first real taste of the votes with all those dropping pretty much right after 11 p.m. The biggest county that typically reports, of course, the biggest county in the state is Maricopa. Maricopa typically reports its first tranche of votes between about, I would say, a minute after polls have closed and 15 minutes after polls have closed. So you're going to get a good chunk of the vote and get a real sense for things pretty quickly early on into the evening. There are two big statewide races on the Republican side. For governor, you've got former TV news anchor Kari Lake, who has President Donald Trump's endorsement, first-time candidate, but has been a strong contender and leads in the polls. And then Karen Taylor Robinson has been endorsed by current Governor Doug Ducey and former Vice President Mike Pence. Current Secretary of State Katie Hobbs is expected to be the Democratic nominee for November and will be challenging one of these two. Like I said, Kari Lake has been leading in polling by about 10 to 12 points. In some of the polls that I've seen, there's been some internal polls released that showed it a much closer race, but she seems to have the edge as of the time of this recording. And we can go ahead with that and slide on over to the U.S. Senate primary on the Republican side, all trying to challenge and flip this seat back to the Republican side after Mark Kelly had won the seat in the special election back in 2020. So they're hoping that the next few Republicans on a name, they're all going to be hoping to come after Kelly and beat him in November. First up, you have Blake Masters. Now, that is former President Trump's endorsed candidate. He's been speaking very loudly about everything with the election and the issues with 2020. That's been kind of his driving force. He's also another candidate backed by Peter Thiel. You see, Peter Thiel had endorsed that other candidate earlier that I'd mentioned. He endorsed Blake Masters here. Then you've got Jim Lamon, who's a solar power industry businessman with very largely self-funded campaign. And then Mark Brnovich. Now, he is the current Attorney General, and the former president, Donald Trump, went out of his way to attack him, saying that he didn't do enough to overturn Arizona's presidential election results back in 2020. So the winner, like I said, is going to take on Senator Mark Kelly. He won a special election 2 years ago to fill the remainder of John McCain's term. Kelly was the favorite in 2020, but led in polling by much wider of a margin than he ended up winning in 2020. And let that be a lesson to those of you who are watching polling going into the midterm elections. We've seen a pattern, and I'll just do this as an aside, we have seen a pattern of the Republican vote being missed, shall we say, when it comes to polling in U.S. Senate races. We saw it very obviously in the state of Maine back in 2020, but we saw this early on in the cycle in 2014. I remember that 8 years ago, where there were polls that showed Mark Pryor comfortably ahead of soon-to-be Senator Tom Cotton, seeing a very, very close race for Marco Rubio, for example, back in 2010. We typically see a pretty good mark of where the Democratic vote share is going to be in a lot of this polling in the lead up to the election, but they seem to miss the mark when it comes to the Republican votes. That doesn't mean you should unskew the polls or that everything's all crazy or the pollsters are terrible. it is very difficult earlier on in a cycle to really capture a lot of who's most interested in voting and to filter out, if you will, or balance out those who are most eager to respond to pollsters. They're not exactly the same thing. You have a higher population of people who really, really like to talk on the phone, and they're going to represent themselves because they're talking on the phone. Meanwhile, you miss the people who don't want to pick up the phone and don't want to talk to a pollster. Anyway, my rant is now over talking about polling. Let's go ahead into the state of Washington. Final state of the night closes at 11 p.m., but of course it's an all-mail-in state essentially, so it's the deadline by which you got to make sure your ballot has been turned in. All primaries are nonpartisan. It's like a top two system like in California. The top two vote getters get to advance to November. No real high-profile races of note. If the environment gets bad enough for the Democrats this year, maybe Patty Murray's Senate seat becomes more interesting. I would say what is worth watching in the state of Washington, and you're going to have to watch this over a couple of days and a couple of weeks because you're going to have to wait for all those mail-ins to come in from all the counties. But watch the two-party vote share in Washington in the individual U.S. House races. It seems to track pretty well with the state's final overall partisan split. For Congress, the Democratic vote share in a primary only rises by a little bit, by about 2.5 points to the general election. It tracks pretty closely, so it'll give you a real sense of how the environment actually is. Sean Trendy's expanded on this a little bit in some eloquent pieces over at Real Clear Politics. G. Elliott Morris and Nate Cohn have also touched on this subject, so if you search for them out of interest for that, they can expand on it with a lot more maps and graphics than I can right here. But yeah, it's something worth watching. Watch the primary vote share. Interestingly enough, the last two elections where the Democrats did not have an outright lead in the vote share margin in the primary, 2010 and 2014. Both were Republican wave years. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little preview diving into the 5 different states and some of the key races to watch. If you like us, please like us here, subscribe and sign up for more videos and future notifications and all that jazz. I'm Brandon Finnegan, Director of Elections here at Decision Desk HQ. Thank you all for watching.